Once again, we are exploring these issues of community, and I mentioned in the introductory remarks yesterday morning that one of the great surprises of the first convening of the American Project, which again was a group of around 30 or 35 people here on our Malibu campus, several people, including my friend here, Rich, were a part of that gathering. One of the great surprises to come out of that conversation was this consensus view that the challenges that America were facing is not so much political, but cultural. And that cultural issue was described variously as loneliness and alienation. This was not on our radar screen at all when we first gathered, but obviously it's where we've gone since then. And you might know that this conference was originally scheduled for August of 2020, and we had a certain global pandemic push us back. And so, as one of the many ironies that I hope are being revealed here over the course of this day and a half, we had to postpone a conference that was discussing loneliness because of a worldwide pandemic that was enforcing and creating even higher levels of loneliness and alienation than we've ever seen. And so this theme continues to be an important part of how we understand the importance of this communitarian thought, because it's a way of, to go back to what Dr. Johnson had mentioned before, is kind of a way of even looking into this counterfactual. How do we understand the importance of the breakdown of community? Well, we're now seeing it through this increased sense of loneliness, in part exacerbated by COVID, to be sure, but this was something that we had seen back in 2017. And if you look or just Google loneliness, I mean, the amount of studies and research, our current Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has made loneliness kind of his major issue that he wants to understand from a public health perspective. We've had these deaths of despair, which are understood by Angus Deaton and Ann Case around the economic impacts, the public health impacts, and obviously the variety of public policy impacts of loneliness. And so we're going to keep discussing this issue because we believe it's a way of understanding the importance of this communitarian approach to politics and policy. Is we see it in the impact that it's having around the breakdown of community and the increasing research that is being done on loneliness. And who better to lead that than our panelists here today. And so to begin that, the co-founder of the American Project, my dear friend Rich Taffel, will lead this conversation. Rich.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to join everybody in thanking Pete and Melissa again for all the work they did in putting this together. This has been such an amazing, rich discussion, and it's a lot of plans and travel plans and organization to pull it off. So very grateful to the Pepperdine School of Public Policy for hosting this event. I'm with Dean Peterson. I think we've kind of come full circle as we do this topic today, loneliness, the cost of a broken community. After 5 years of this project and 2 days of panels, the poem that came to mind is a piece from T.S. Eliot, from The Little Gidding, where he says, "You shall not cease from exploring, and at the end of all your exploring, you will arrive where you started and know it for the first time." And I feel like we've come almost full circle. We came to that event, and Michael Hendricks, I got to give you a shout out. At that first conference, Michael, everybody had to do a paper, and Michael did a paper with loneliness in the topic of the paper, the early identifier. And I remember it was, for me, it was Christina Arriga, if I'm pronouncing her, at the Beckett Foundation. And at one point in the conversations, much like this, she just turned to everybody on a panel that we were doing, and she said, you know, we all came with different topics. We came from all different areas, and we're all saying that there's a loneliness crisis, an alienation crisis. Isn't that weird? And that synthesizing that she did in that moment, I think generated what we're doing today, what we're understanding, and of course has been reinforced, as Pete pointed out, by a pandemic and by the polarization in our politics. It's all connected. I do want to thank Dean Peterson for doing what I think few people do in the academy, which is taking a topic and going deeper with it and digging and not, he announced at the beginning of this, he was nervous when he did the conference because he didn't have the answer. We need more of that in the academy. We need more people to say, I don't know where this is going to go, but I'm going to ask a lot of questions. Let's see what we can learn, instead of, here's the answers, we're going to do this. So I do applaud Dean Peterson for digging into this topic, and for what we have today is a panel of two of the leading experts in the country on the topic of loneliness. And I want to also echo the point that Dean Peterson mentioned, particularly in your opening comments about public policy, how it relates to public policy. I did a series of dinners for the American Project in Washington, D.C., generally with young staffers or politicos, younger people. And they would always, when I would say, one of the topics I want to explore at this dinner is loneliness. DC is very transactional. It's actually a very lonely city. And they would just be like, that has nothing to do with anything. Like, explain this to me. And I finally came up with a quote that sort of cemented it. I'll just share it. It's from Hannah Arendt. She says, what prepares men for totalitarian denomination is the non-totalitarian world, for in a non-totalitarian world is loneliness. Once a borderline experience, usually suffered in a certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience. So what we're seeing is that loneliness that we're going to be talking about today has a direct impact on policy, and it has incredibly dangerous consequences for a different type of government, including totalitarianism. I think she was right on in 1951 when she said that. So that solidified it. People are like, okay, I get that. Okay, that is absolutely true. So it's very important for us to dig into it deeper today. And we have these two experts that I'll be introducing, and they'll be speaking. But this is the sort of topics that we wanted to cover today. And we can go anywhere. We have a nice sized group that we could have an open discussion if you have comments, so it can be very engaging. But here are some of the topics that we wanted to tackle today. What's the current state of loneliness in America from these experts? What are the causes? How's it playing out differently among different generations? What's the role of identity in this crisis? And then how is it impacting our political life together? So those are just some. And it wouldn't be an American Project event if we didn't say what are some of the solutions. And so we'll also be looking at those. So let me introduce our two speakers today we're very lucky to have. Our first presenter will be Dr. Jean Twenge, a professor of psychology at San Diego State University, who I believe drove up today from San Diego. God bless you. She's the author of over 180 scientific publications, and she's written a book that's gotten quite a bit of acclaim. You may have seen her talk about it on most of the major media and TV shows. It's called iGen. Why today's super connected kids are growing up less rebellious, more tolerant, less happy, and completely unprepared for adulthood. And she has an upcoming book that is coming out shortly.
Yeah, end of March.
End of March, okay, so at the end of March, look for this one. Generations, the real differences between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silents, and what they mean for America's future. And she's pulling this together on a database of over 11 million young people. So it's really research-based. We're going to get the benefits of that today. And Jean will be really approaching this more with a clinical perspective and has handouts that we'll be looking at today. And then we also have our second presenter is Francine Broghammer. And many of you could be familiar with her because she was a speaker at our last in-person event. She did a panel with Dean Peterson. And she is on the advisory board of the American Project. So that's an awesome development. She's emerged as one of the leading experts in the country on the topic of loneliness. She's a board-certified psychiatrist, a clinical director of inpatient mental health in the state of Minnesota, where she's now living. And so she has become an expert on the topic of loneliness, but also on the flip side, flourishing. And she'll be looking at it from more of an identity perspective. So we've got these different perspectives. We'll be looking at it clinically, particularly with the generational impact, and then we'll also be looking at it from an identity perspective. So with that, I'm going to ask Jean to kick us off and give a presentation, then Francine will speak. And then if you have a question for each other, I have some questions, and then we'll just open it up to a discussion. So does that sound good? Good, excellent. So thank you, Jean and Francine, for being here today.
All right, so you should have some nice, colorful handouts. I usually do presentation, but this suffices very well. So as Rich mentioned, I work with these big data sets, often of young people. They're great because they are nationally representative and very large. So that means we can get a real cross-section of everybody across the country and really see what's going on with young people. So one that I work with the most is called Monitoring the Future, and it surveys 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders, and it's done that for loneliness anyway, back to the early 1990s. So it's really a national treasure, and the 2021 data, the first data we have from that survey during the pandemic, was released on Tuesday. So you guys can be the first to see it on one of these graphs. So our first one on slide number 3 here is the pattern in loneliness. So it's 6 items, and it asks young people about their feelings. And so 2 of them are, how often do you feel left out? And how often do you feel lonely? And as you can see, those feelings are actually declining between the early 1990s and early 2010s until they just shot upward. And you did see an increase, especially in feeling lonely through that pandemic data in 2021. There's a little bit of a jump. However, the elbow of the graph where the change really begins was 10 years ago. It did not begin during the pandemic. It really accelerated about 2011, 2012, where those feelings went up in this age group. So that's the US data. And then about a year ago, John Haidt and I and some colleagues published data on loneliness from a global survey. And in 36 out of 37 countries around the world, teens reported more loneliness in 2018 than they had in previous years. And you can see the pattern is almost identical to the US data, very little change until 2012, and then it goes upward, at least in 3 of the regions, a little bit of a different pattern in Asia. So then if you flip it over, that's what you want to do, not turn it, but flip it. I'm glad that Rich mentioned the idea of loneliness being broader. So we do think of loneliness as that's one thing, it's people not feeling connected, but has wide-ranging implications. So one of those implications is that loneliness is strongly linked to clinical level depression. And that's what you can see in slide 5 here is the rise in clinical level depression among teens and among young adults. And here, again, that elbow is at 2012. You do see an increase between 2019 and 2020. This has pandemic data as well. But the change started 10 years ago. Now, there's kind of one missing slide here that I'll describe verbally, because I think it's important, since we're talking about public policy and the relationship between loneliness and community and these things to democracy and our national discussion, which is there was a survey that was done in 2020, and it asked about views of the country. So that's important here because depression and loneliness aren't just emotional, they're cognitive. They affect how people see the world and how they thus think about government and how they think about what's going on in the nation. So that survey asked questions like, do you think significant changes are needed to our government? So a fair amount of boomers said yes, but the vast majority of young adults, or Gen Z, said yes to that question. I believe it was 3/4 said significant changes are needed. Then another question was, do you think America is a fair society or an unfair society? And again, some boomers said yes, but 2/3, the good majority of young adults, said yes to that. Now, I was analyzing this for my new book, and this was one where this next question just kind of knocked me out of my chair. The question was, do you believe that the founders of the United States are better described as heroes or as villains? Only about 1 out of 10 boomers said villains. 4 out of 10 young adults, Gen Z, said villains. So it's not just that they have a negative view of what's going on now and that things need to be changed. It's also this negative view of things 250 years in the past. So I think that cognitive element and how it then relates to how people see the nation is important too. So then there's the why question. And in my view, the strongest case can be made for this. Simply, we have more loneliness and depression because young people started spending less time with their friends in person, that's slide 6, and more time on social media and online, and that's slide 7. And in slide 8, you can see that yellow line, that's unemployment in the global data. It's completely misaligned. So in other words, the economy was getting better because unemployment was going down at the same time that teen depression and loneliness were going up. So that's when you'd expect people to be happier and more connected if we have economic good times, and exactly the opposite happened. And what lines up is time spent online. That lines up almost perfectly with loneliness.
Thank you. Francine?
Yeah, so if I could piggyback off this, I think the data is a wonderful place to start. And it's very apparent to me that I come from a different lens from most people in this room. Most physicians don't have a lot of meaningful comments on public policy, if you will. But I think what I can afford here is a view into the clinical, how this presents in day-to-day life and what I've seen. So I'd like to start by maybe segueing from some of the research on adolescence with a story of an adolescent I worked with just a few years back. His name was Rico. He was a 12-year-old boy brought into my emergency room by his grandma. Now, Rico was born to a mother out of wedlock. Shortly after he was born, Dad left the home. Over the preceding years, 4, 5, 6, 7 father figures, if you will, rotated through the home. Unfortunately, oftentimes he was forced to face neglect, if not outright abuse. Shortly after this, Mom turned to pills. 1 hit turned to 2, turned to 3, turned to 4, and it was no longer safe for him to stay in the home. So he had to either face the foster care system or be taken in by someone in his extended family. Grandma took him in. And she noticed when he got there, things weren't quite right with Rico. He was really quiet, wouldn't make a lot of eye contact, kept to himself, didn't talk much, really quick to anger. Didn't really seem to care much about what she was doing in the day-to-day, but what he did care about was video games. What he would do was play an hour or 2 and he got upset, and that seemed to pacify him. But quickly, 1 hour turned to 2, turned to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It wasn't hard for Grandma to say, well, I don't think this is healthy, and she actually removed the Xbox from his bedroom. When he came home and saw that it wasn't there, he ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, went to Grandma, held it to her neck, and said, I'm going to kill you if you don't give it back. And he was brought to my emergency room. He was actually placed in an inpatient adolescent psychiatric hospital at that point, and he proceeded to have about 5 hospitalizations over the next 3 years for either threatening violence to himself or others, including suicide attempts. Rico was diagnosed with something called reactive attachment disorder, which is essentially what happens when a young child is deprived of secure attachments early on in their life. They're taught that the connection is threatening and scary, and they don't know how to accept that. I bring up this example here because while loneliness and isolation, separation from meaningful connection can plague all of us at different points in our life, sometimes we have different names for it, right? In youth or adolescence, we can call it reactive attachment disorder, but as we get slightly older, we see maybe a nod towards the depths of despair, if you will. It's no longer called reactive attachment disorder, but people feel anxious or depressed. They maybe turn inwards, think about taking their lives via suicide, or maybe over a slightly longer period of time with drugs of abuse and alcohol. But the thing that all of this has in common is that when we don't have meaningful connection, we forget how to trust each other. We forget how to lean on each other, and it has a negative impact on both our mental and our physical health, with loneliness actually being equivalent on your physical health to smoking about 15 cigarettes a day in the long run. So when Pete and I first started this conversation at the conference back in 2017, we looked at some of the worst work from Ann Case, Angus Deaton, Deaths of Despair. Well, let's look at it now, 2021. We're unfortunately in 2021, I know we're 2022 now, but looking at the 2021 stats, loneliness is over 60% of Americans. Or sorry, it's over 1/3 of Americans, with over 60% of adolescents identifying as lonely, and 50% of young mothers identifying as lonely. So it's there, and it's pervasive. And what do we do about this? This is something I've really appreciated about this conference. It's not just what's the problem, but what's the solution, right? Well, to answer this question, I want to give a nod to Ben Sass. And he wrote a book that actually we were just talking about them. He did a beautiful job of boiling down really complex social science into 4 really pithy questions to understand health, human flourishing. 1, do you have a family that loves you and whom you love in return? 2, do you have work that matters? 3, do you have someone that you can trust and confide in when you're going through a difficult time? And 4, do you have a way to make sense of suffering and death? Now, each of these questions harkens to the institutions we've been talking about for the last 4 days: family, friends, community, and faith. And Ben did a great job in his book. He said, let's think about each of these questions as a leg of a chair of your overall happiness, right? If you can answer affirmatively, yes, I have all 4 of these things, your happiness is actually pretty stable. But all of a sudden you lose one, and it's pretty hard to sit on a chair with 3 legs. It's almost impossible to sit on a chair with 2 legs, right? And so when we look at what's plaguing America right now, loneliness, if you will, we're looking at people that can't even answer yes to one of these questions. That's problematic. But I want to push this concept a little bit further from loneliness in and of itself to understanding that these institutions that we're talking about, faith, family, home, work, it's not just that they give us connection, but they give us a sense of identity, a way to understand ourselves in relationship to the world. We're really complex beings. If you can answer yes to those 4 questions, you're a mother, you're a father, you're a brother, sister, teacher, bus driver, team member, volunteer. You're all of these different things. You're a very complex being. But all of a sudden, you can't answer yes to any of those. Well, who are you? And as we segue into our modern moment, the age of identity politics, if you will, there's incredible forces at play pushing us to say, you're not these 5 really robust things or these 10 really robust things. You are a sexual preference or you are a political view. And that makes our identities very, very narrow. And it doesn't confer a lot of protection when we face suffering. And I'm going to go on a little tangent here. I won't take long, I promise. But okay. Just stepping to the side of this, I want to talk about suffering briefly. Because suffering in and of itself is not mental illness. There is nothing greater than when I have someone step into my office and say, you know, I just started at a new school, I have this seminar, I have really bad anxiety every time I have to get up and talk, and I think I have an anxiety disorder and I think I need meds. And I get to go, well, I think you're human and you don't need meds. And this is going to be okay, and over time it's going to get easier if we look at kind of behavioral learning. What's scary at first isn't scary down the road, right? But in our modern age, the question has become, is any suffering okay? And if we can harken back now to this idea of a really complex identity, understanding yourself in relationship to the world, what this complex identity gives us is the ability to face suffering because we know we're not going to go it alone. And that's really, really important, because when you face suffering and when you overcome suffering, you build resilience, which has a really important impact for mental health in the long run, right? So in closing, I think I'll share just one last clinical anecdote, if you will. With these very narrow identities that the current climate is encouraging us to develop at this point in time, they're tenuous identities. They leave us at risk for a lot of things. I worked with a patient just a couple years ago. She identified as gay. Her father was a pastor. She was from the Midwest. She didn't feel that she belonged, so she moved out to LA. She was bouncing between jobs. She had a girlfriend. They were on again, off again, but she found a good community, a good group of friends, and she said, I think I'm getting traction and I belong. But what happened with the transgender movement gaining some traction, she said, well, I don't know. She voiced her hesitations or concerns. You know, is the homosexual ideology the same as the transgender ideology? Because it seems to me these 2 things might be fundamentally different, and that's an entirely separate conversation. But the moral of the story is she voiced her concern, and she was actually ousted from this community. And so she came to me in a state of truly despair and contemplating suicide, because she goes, if I don't belong here, I have nowhere else that I belong. She didn't have work that mattered. She had left her family and friends. She had, in many ways, left her religious beliefs as well when she chose to move out to California from her home. And she had nothing at that point in time that was conferring this protection, because her identity was so shallow. She was left vulnerable to not only loneliness, but despair, and then thoughts of suicide. So something really important was said yesterday, and that's that we're tasked with tilling a broken garden. And I think that's beautiful. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And when we sit here and we talk about solutions, where do we go from here? I want to propose the following framework. Does what we're proposing give people an avenue to build a more robust identity than they would have before they partook? If what we're proposing, a specific policy, a specific initiative, heck, even an event, can you understand yourself more fully in relation to the world than you did before we did that? And if so, I think it's a worthwhile initiative. And that's a lens that will confer not only health and mental health, but meaningful connection and longevity and purpose.
Thank you. Beautiful. I told you we'd have fantastic presentations from these scholars, and they did not let us down. That was excellent. Thank you, both of you. I'm going to start with a question. By the way, if you have a question for each other, do you have a question for each other to start with? If not, I'll jump in.
First.
Okay, let me kick in. Okay, first. I always like to go to the experts first. But yeah, one of the themes that you're talking about, and Jean, with your timetable of when this thing just goes like this, and in your experiences too, Francine, there's a question of what's causing it, and we can certainly see a correlation with social media. And what I'm also hearing is social media crisscrossing with ideological changes in the culture as well. And I'll just say from my experience, I'm a pastor, I do coaching and strategy for social entrepreneurs. I'm experiencing a nihilism, is the best way I can describe it, among young people, which would be something like, it just doesn't matter. You know, the world will be, the climate's going to destroy the world, or there is nothing after this life, and so what's, like, it's, you make your money, you do it, but there's no, what's the point? WTF, you know, like, I don't get it. And it's just like a nihilist. I was just curious if you're seeing, you know, maybe Jean, you could start, do you see any intersection with, say, what I'm calling nihilism? There's no meaning, and then putting that on top of the fact that I'm on social media?
I mean, I think that's one of the strongest generational trends I've ever seen in 30 years of doing this, is that transition between millennials, very optimistic, self-confident, sometimes entitled, it wasn't all good, but lots of optimism and positivity, to huge amounts of negativity with the next generation. And just so we're on the same page, I'm defining millennials as those born between 1980 and 1994, and Gen Z or iGen as those born between 1995 and roughly 2012. So that's going to be, you know, school kids up until 27-year-olds. So it's pretty much all young adults, most traditional age college students and so on. Just enormous amounts of negativity. And not just about themselves and how lonely they feel and depressed they are, but about the world and their view of things. And the lack of meaning is absolutely there. So these surveys ask about things like, you know, the importance of meaning and purpose in life, and that has gone down over the generations. College student survey asks about the importance of developing a meaningful philosophy of life, and that's also gone down. What's gone up, and this is the long-standing trend that started with Gen X, is the importance of making a lot of money, being well off financially, getting the college degree. So it's extrinsic values, as psychologists call them, as opposed to the intrinsic values. And that piece has been going on for a while, but Gen Z takes that and then has this very negative view of, exactly, it really is nihilism. It's, you know, nothing matters, everything is terrible, the world's on fire. And then social media exaggerates that. Nobody goes on Twitter to say, hey, everything is fine, it's really cool, it's a great day today. You know, it just doesn't happen. It's this very negative place that just amplifies it.
Francine, any thoughts?
Yeah, and if I could piggyback off that, I think it's very dangerous to be in a place of nihilism, because we've talked about the importance of hope before, right? And hope is, when I do a screening in the ER for suicide risk, for example, the very first thing I'm screening for and screening throughout is there hope present? Because people can endure a lot of suffering. Think about Man's Search for Meaning, right? Individuals in internment camps could overcome an unbelievable amount of so many different types of suffering as long as they felt that things would get better, right? I would be reunited with my brother, my sister, my wife, my husband. But in the absence of that hope, the question becomes, well, what's the point? Like you said, the climbing's due, but what's the point? Why try, right? And so when we combine how dangerous it can be to have a lack of hope or to fall to a state of despair with this nihilistic piece, and then the push for identity politics, well, am I identifying as nihilist, and therefore by nature undermining my ability to have hope and actually be resilient and succeed? And I think this is a very dangerous combination, the way the three have been tied together in that way.
Wow, yeah, I would agree. And I personally always felt that one of the worst things you can do to a human being is convince them they're a victim of something so much they have no agency over their life. And then that just is a perpetual cycle. But if I can dig deeper in the generational, because these are stunning statistics, and we have to also look to our future, and our future really is our young people. So I'm going to dig a little deeper on that. Recently, at an event that, actually an event Pete and I met at years ago, the Citizens University, which I'm part of now, they have a young cohort of high school students. And so I sat with them recently, and they kept telling me how anxious, nervous they were. It was just a very honest discussion. And when I dug deeper, like, so what's, and they were talking, I'm really afraid to say anything. And they kept punctuating their sentences by saying, and I'm progressive. But if I say, and I said, like, what are the issues? What issues are you anxious about? And they would say, and they wouldn't say, because they were afraid. And so I just kept digging a little deeper. I was like, is it, LGBT issues, race? Yes. Whatever it was. And like, well, my parents are immigrants, and they have really different values. And the values that I have at school are completely different. And, I'm trying to navigate who I am and what those values are. And I'm just, the topic of resilience came up in your comments, and I'm like, they're not resilient, essentially what they're saying. They're saying, I'm terrified, I'm very afraid, and I feel like things could be canceled on me in a second. What is there a counter to that? How do we build community? Because even to enter into community requires resilience. You know what I mean? Like, to sit with somebody else that you disagree with, you're going to be with somebody you don't like. Someone's going to be boring. Someone's going to talk too much, like maybe I am now, right? But you're going to have that. You're going to deal with different people. Do you have any insights on how, particularly for younger people, we can talk about building resilience to enter into the public square?
Yeah. And I think this is a really important segue maybe between kind of the mental health clinical piece and what you've been talking about. But something really important came up yesterday when everyone was sharing their different interventions. And in particular, what really struck me was the prisoners, rehabilitating prisoners after they're released. And what came of that is they found that when they gave them a police mentor, they viewed all of a sudden the police as human beings, right? They're not this idea that's there, that's against me, that's here to take me down, but it's actually sitting in community with someone else, you recognize that they're a full being, they're this complex identity, and they're not just this idea that's out to get me, right? And so expanding the way we communicate to be more dynamic. If we're only communicating over social media, it's a me versus you represent this idea you put forth on your post or however you're communicating online. But if we can actually sit down and recognize, well, you might believe this politically, and I might believe this politically, but we both also love dogs, and we're both going to this concert next month, and we're both also worried about the upcoming election, and all of a sudden it's more dynamic, and it's much harder to say, well, you're a bad person. Mm-hmm. You just say, I disagree with you. Mm-hmm. But when we have very, very shallow identities, if your whole identity is, say, for example, your sexual preference, and someone questions that, the ability to have a productive conversation is almost zero, because you can't navigate that conversation and maybe acquiesce to this idea or that idea without completely abandoning who you are. Mm-hmm. So we need to have communications in a more robust platform than social media in and of itself would allow, so that we can recognize the other person as a full and worthy human being.
I mean, I agree with you completely. I mean, that's the issue is, it's not that technology is bad, it's not technology is awesome. It's that the way we communicate, particularly on social media, is shallow, and we only see people for certain opinions or certain identities, and we don't really get to know them and see what we have in common in a way that can happen when you're face to face, sometimes in 2 or 3 minutes. You know, that it's another human being, and you can see the expression on their face when you say something, and you have a back and forth, and you may, you know, realize quickly the things that you have in common, even if you do have areas of disagreement. So I think that has to be first step is, you know, where is that conversation taking place? Because this generation lives on social media and lives online, and that is very good for some things, but having a deep conversation is not one of them.
And if I could piggyback off that, an idea that popped up as you're sharing this is the accountability of the media, because we can sit here and have this really robust conversation here, and we can nod and we can agree and we can disagree, and then there's that video camera in the back that might just take a 10-second clip and post it somewhere else later, and if it's out of context and I'm not having this human interaction with the person that's watching it on the other end, that's the scary piece too, right? So we have to be stewards not only for how we communicate in person, but how it is shared and expanded beyond this room and this interaction as well.
We're going to go to questions in 1 second. And just one quick observation, and that I really like one of the themes that's come up in the conference is we're not going back to a perfect day. From Josh's comments, re-enchanting the world. As the dean said, we're not going back to white picket fences and white people. That world of like, if we just went back to that, everything would be fine is a very simplistic thing. I think conservatives tend to do that too often. It's not, and we're really looking at this new world. I just want to share one quick example. Being a pastor of a church, a woman in my church, no kids, no husband, is dying and has no will, has no plan. And so the minister and the community end up becoming the community. And it was actually very beautiful. And she didn't have a family, but she had a community. The young people in the church community said, that's the most interesting thing I've ever seen at church, was this. And what I realized was they'd never seen anybody kind of pulling together. I thought that, that's what you do. But I think we have to reimagine how we're going to build those networks. It's not going to be going back and saying, you have to have this type of situation. And it's, that woman that you were talking about who lost her friendships and her network over a political issue, she's not going to go back necessarily to a certain culture. She's going to have to figure it out. How we can help people build community into this future, what's the future look like, I think is really what we're getting at. But I do see some hands up, so I'm gonna silence my questions and let's open up to questions. So let's just start here, 1, 2, 3. So why don't we start right here?
Yeah.
If you can talk loud.
That I can do.
Okay, thank you.
Tocqueville said at one point that the average American spends a lot of time thinking about someone insignificant, namely himself. And this is the kind of world of mass democracy, right? Everybody becomes really inconsequential. We've done something even beyond that, and we've created this idea of global citizenship. And if you want to really make young people feel inconsequential, helpless, powerless, tell them that they're global citizens and they're somehow responsible for situations over which they have no control whatsoever. In the meantime, if you think about something like Robert Frost's mending wall, good fences make good neighbors. Why? Because neighbors have to repair the fence together. Right? They're picking up the stones, they're putting the stones back in place. You're all Apple Orchard, I'm all Pine Grove, right? And they're talking to each other, and now they're engaged in a mutual project that's meaningful. So I just wonder how much this language of global citizenship and so forth is setting young people back in terms of their kind of identity formations.
Either of you feel?
I can jump in. So I think you're right. It's the sense of a loss of agency, right? If this problem is so big I can't have an impact, then why try? And something that's really stuck out kind of as a counterpoint that we talked about, the panels that I think everybody took home with them last night were, what are we doing on a very small local level? And the reality is that no two interventions are the same because this community's needs is different than that community's needs. So how do we address the world's needs, right? And so it's changing the conversation to say, I'll use a football analogy, it's a game of inches, right? It's not going to be a Hail Mary that's going to solve climate change or this problem or that problem, but how are we fighting for those inches in our local community, if you will, right? And that, if we can just change the dialogue ever so slightly, will give people back that sense of agency. and that, okay, how do we meet this specific need in front of me for the overall goal of winning the game or getting the touchdown, but how do I fight for the 6 inches right in front of me? And so I think we need to, I agree with you completely that the loss of agency in that global conversation is very real and very demoralizing, but I think we do have the ability to flip the conversation ever so slightly to build some of that agency back in, if you will.
Thank you. Right here, and then here.
Hi, my name is Jennifer.
Josh.
Thanks for being here. I have 2 questions, more related to policy, trying to get just beyond the philosophical, which is wonderful and I love. But C.S. Lewis talked about something called chronological snobbery, meaning we look back at the past generations as like, well, they didn't know, like what you were saying about there's a view of history now that 2/3 of what is it,
Gen Z.
Gen Z is now saying, they were terrible, horrible villains. So it seems that society is confirming parents are no longer the authoritative kind of guide. They're either abdicating their own authority to experts that tell them what's better for their children, or we see it in schools, right, where the schools are kind of taking away the agency of the parents. So how do we combat, like, when society's kind of taking this authority away from the parents and leaving the children looking to almost strangers who may not have that same tie? So what do we do with that? But similarly, how can we not demonize social media? Like you said, we can't go back to white picket fences and the 50s, and I don't think anybody really wants that. But also acknowledge that something like TikTok from a foreign agency like China, who knows how to undercut our culture to kind of come in, and knows that that's the most powerful thing they can do is divide us.
Right.
Do we have the political will to ban something like TikTok and say, like India did? No, because the fact is China uses different algorithms for their TikTok to show kids nature and math competitions, and whereas our kids are getting twerking and disfiguring their bodies. It's actually two separate businesses. So again, what are the policies?
What do you think? Do you have policy suggestions on the social media space?
Oh, yes.
So why don't you?
Probably too many.
But I think it would be good,
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, let's enforce COPA. Children 12 and under should not be on social media, and that's what the platforms say their policy is, and nobody enforces it.
Just enforce
There are
the
9 and 10-year-olds on TikTok on a regular basis, and it just is not enforced at all. So COPA is a 1998 law, Children's Online Protection something. But it says just for data collection reasons mostly you have to be 13. But you just check a box or you put your birthday, and that's it. There's no verification of age. I mean, can you imagine if, okay, the drinking age is 21, but you're going to show up, I'd like a bottle of whiskey, where's your ID? Oh, I don't have it, just believe me. That's basically what we're doing with social media. And you don't have to have parental permission. So kids get into all kinds of bad situations of various sorts, and their parents have no idea because their parents didn't even give them permission because they don't need it to open an account. So those are just 2 things. I mean, social media is extremely unregulated, and if we're going to start somewhere, let's start with regulating it for minors. And this is one of the few things that has bipartisan agreement these days. I mean, imagine that. The hearings, it was both sides of the aisle.
Yeah. The worm has turned on the social media companies, and the parents are really furious. You were next with a question.
Yes, thanks. 2 observations and then a question. First, thank God for the Sabbath. In my home, there's no technology, so I really would urge my Christian friends, make the Sabbath a holy day again, and your kids and your family will be different. Just an observation. 2, I love the data. There's a similar data for showing how language changed in media. Racism, white supremacy, all those words. The key year was 2012. So we see 2 different phenomenon, same year, things changed. So, I mean, clearly something happened in 2012. I know John Haidt has some theories about that, the like button and things like that, but I find that really interesting. We're talking about a number of things that happened. My question, maybe more because you have the data, is are there exceptions, place-based exceptions? neighborhood, country, where are things not following the general trend, and why is a neighborhood, why is a location, a country, why are they different among 8, 10, 12 grades? I mean,
Right.
you can focus on the
Right.
age, the generation,
Right.
whatever you want. I'm
Right.
very curious.
Right. So just based on privacy, we can't go to the neighborhood level in this type of data. For the global data, I noted 36 out of 37 countries. So the why question is really tough, because the one place that didn't show an increase in loneliness was South Korea, and there's plenty of technology there, but it may have been other cultural things, more collectivistic culture, other things going on that may have mitigated some of that. So yeah, breaking it up by region, especially within the US, pretty much everybody shows the same trends. It's pretty universal. Really, the only place you see a difference, you don't see much of a difference based on region or race or ethnicity. You do see it somewhat based on gender. Loneliness, for example, that rise is much more pronounced among girls than among boys, probably because girls spend more time on social media, and just the structure of their social lives is different. One brief thing that we may not be talking about the same data, but the stuff that you were talking about the focus on language in media, several people have made the case for things changing more like 2015 around that issue.
The tablet article.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I think it did maybe start around then. But so like Matt Iglesias calls it the Great Awakening. That's his term, and he points it to about 2015. So, but it was, it's not that far off, but it doesn't line up exactly with this. It comes a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Gene Peterson?
Yeah, thank you for this panel, this conversation. I wanted to direct this question to Gene first. That data point, the data points that you brought out about views of America and the American past, to me, cuts straight to the heart of this entire American Project effort. And of course, social scientists are always about the questions of causation and correlation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the first time I've ever seen a possible nexus between these issues of loneliness and views not only of yourself, but views of the country in its current state and past. And so my question is, certainly this seems to be a trend line heading in a very toxic direction if we care about the American Project. But I'm wondering, are you seeing the issues of loneliness and alienation causing these views of the American present and past, or being exacerbated by these views that they are taking in from other places?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is always hard to answer that. Especially given the data we have, we can't randomly assign people to be born at different times and see what happens. It's logically impossible, right? So we have to go on what we have. I mean, I think just kind of from a thinking it through logically point of view, I think it does make more logical sense for it to begin with the person and then move to the views of the nation rather than vice versa. Although I think there's clearly some of both. There usually is, but I come back to the research on depression and on cognitive behavioral therapy, and how cognitive behavioral therapy for depression challenges the way people think, and then that changes how they feel. So it stands to reason that if you're depressed because you're not hanging out with your friends in person and you don't have that sense of connection and you don't have the sense of meaning, then your lens for seeing things outside yourself is going to be more negative. So that's kind of the reasoning that I take it through. But I should also defer to the psychiatrist when it comes to that.
Well, I think what's really interesting in what you brought up here, Pete, is, and the stats were really harrowing. We didn't say it was bad policy or it was, a bad document. It was the founders were villains. We were speaking to who they were as people as opposed to what product they put out, right? Which I think is probably the most telling piece of that, because we're at a point where we're equating people's specific beliefs or one-time action with who they are fundamentally as a person. We talked about yesterday the measure of a man not being what he does, but what he does after he errs, right? And so if we lose the ability to give people that grace, that forgiveness, and to recognize they're more than a simple action or a simple document you put out. Imagine if you're being judged by a paper you wrote 25 years ago in your career. Maybe that's what you believe now, maybe it's not, who knows, right? But you can't boil people down to one thing, and I think that I agree with you. I think it's starting at the individual level and kind of going retroactively as opposed to the opposite.
Just a quick follow-up. Is it fair to say, Gene, especially with your upcoming book, because I've seen some data on this, that it really is up to Gen X to save the United?
Well, as a Gen Xer, yeah, but we probably don't want to, would be my guess. And I mean, look, to take a more clear-eyed view of my own group, you know, we've tried, but there's some things within us that are blocking that from happening. Cynicism, that same sort of nihilism that Gen Z has. Gen X has a form of that too. And then I think Gen X as a generation, have also sometimes fallen into that victim trap because they've said, well, it's all the boomers' fault. And in my view, I think it's so counterproductive to talk about whose fault it is and to point fingers. You know, we are all in this together. Let's all try to solve it together. But that's been such a big part of the generational conversation for so long. I don't know what will happen until we move on from that, which we really need to do.
Thanks. Josh and then Ryan, and then we'll go to Roberta.
Well, a couple things. First, I mean, in the 1990s, there was all the talk about us being involved in that project of expressive individualism. This is Robert Nisbet et al.
Yeah.
But it does seem like something has changed here. And I'm thinking about the younger generation. They're all proclaiming that they have these afflictions and these problems. But one of the things that's changed is that to be a person now in the rubric of identity politics, it's not simply about expressing yourself. It's that you have to indicate that you are a victim of something. And so the only way you can count, the only way you can have a public voice, is if you declare something that you might not even necessarily believe. So I'm asking, to what extent do you think the pathologies that you're identifying, I'm lonely, I'm this, I'm that, are the things that one must necessarily declare to count as a person within this identity politics rubric?
I mean, I do think that dynamic does occur. However, I think it's pretty clear that these trends are not just due to people saying they feel this way or being more comfortable admitting to it or thinking that will get them status, because the exact same trends appear for emergency room admissions for self-harm, including among 10 to 14-year-old girls, where it's quadrupled, and the suicide rate in these age groups, which is doubled. So it's not just embracing the identity or the feelings, it's also coming out in objectively measured behaviors. So, although I do think in the premise of your question that does occasionally happen online these days, I think these trends are not unlikely to be due to that alone or that primarily.
I agree. And just to provide a little bit of background on that, we shared an article about teenagers currently are self-identifying with a specific sexual preference, that they're far more often than they're actually practicing that sexual preference. So I might tell you I'm bisexual, but my actual practices don't reflect that at all. So it's this need. What they're saying is, I want to belong to a specific group, and maybe it's a marginalized group, that victim culture that you're referencing here. But what's interesting is that behaviors don't always line up with that, and I think that in that gap somewhere lies our opportunity for really meaningful intervention, because these are the individuals who are saying, I want to belong, and this is the language I've been told that I have to use in order to belong.
Yeah, I would just to jump on that. I think that it's a really interesting thing. There is a whole victim status thing going on, particularly on TikTok and on social media, where people are talking about their ADHD or their illnesses or Tourette syndrome or other things they're sort of created, to your point. But I just know, having worked with young people and the number of people I've had to go to the emergency room to meet with, they're not making that up. So there's that's I don't think that's something they're embracing. But I do think this point, we did share an article there, LGBT self-identification has increased among younger people to something like 24%. And we were talking about, why is that? Why would you do that?
It's a lot more than that, by the way, but that's a whole other discussion.
Oh, okay. So what is that? That can't be. And in this case, the behavior doesn't follow. In fact, sexual behavior among heterosexual kids is down. So it's not But I was my own personal theory is in a culture where inclusion is critical and an important thing. You basically are saying, I don't want to. I am not. I don't think I'm gay, but I would certainly be open to it because I'm not closed to. It's like a way of being inclusive. And I think queer and gender theory and gender fluidity are playing into that, where you're saying I'm just not exclusive. I'm inclusive. But that's a case where we really don't see the behaviors. But I think on the depression. And particularly among young women, it seems like your statistics are pretty powerful. So thank you for that. I want to go to Ryan next.
Thanks. Yeah, great discussion. Thanks. We do these large surveys at Brian Streeter from American Enterprise Institute. We've known each other by email, but haven't met in person yet, so this is great. We do these large national surveys. We've built a survey center over the last 4 or 5 years to do that. And a few years ago, we did a survey where we asked the UCLA Loneliness Index battery of questions. So for those who haven't heard, 20 questions or so that basically are a way of teasing out, how socially isolated people are. And you create an index and you plot all the recipients along it. You kind of see who's lonely, who's not, where the national average is. And in that same survey, we did a Bob Putnam kind of thing where we asked all the traditional kind of volunteering questions and how frequently you do, if you do, what kind of organization. Gave people 11 different types of organizations to choose from that you volunteer frequently, once a month or more. And not surprisingly, the data corroborated what Bob and others and Byron and others have found, that people that regularly volunteer are less lonely than the national average. Their scores were lower on the index scores, with one exception, and that were the people that said they volunteered in politics. And so that was kind of an interesting finding. It sort of also confirmed, every annoying person in my life in Washington, D.C. Data explanation for. But obviously these data points are windows into much more complex social phenomena. The reason why people volunteer in the first place and all those things. And of those selections on the drop-down, politics is about the only type of volunteering that you can do not in person on the list too, which also raises some questions. So the question that I have, as we've looked at that and tried to tease out what's going on by some of the other questions in a survey like that, we haven't replicated that survey. We've done other things. I'm not sure that anyone else has. So it raises more questions than it answers. But the first question I just have is, knowing that data point from your respective disciplines, what do you think that is? How would you explain it? But my main question is, what sorts of things? This similar to the question Seth asked. When it comes to the kind of unhappiness that seems to be correlated with kind of overly ideological political engagement, where you're living in a politics of abstraction, you're always going to be frustrated because our Constitution basically designed our politics not to be a good platform for personal fulfillment, and it's become a performative platform. And so these findings aren't exactly surprising, that people that throw kind of all of their energies when they're not at home at work into politics are unhappy. But there are a lot of people that are engaged in politics who still are happy. There's something else is going on in their lives. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to what sorts of things mediate the kind of loneliness and unhappiness that attends to sort of all the ideological frustration in our communities, or in our nation right now, what are the things that stand out, either clinically or in the data, as the things that mediate against that? Because you can have strong political views and have a really strong opinion about these things that we're debating about, and yet you're still grounded and you're happy and you're not the person on the chart that you're worried about. What are the best interventions? Or what are the best other things that mediate all the negative stuff that we've been talking about?
So perhaps I could jump in first here. I think the most telling population that will answer your question is, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of individuals around the turn of retirement, actually, and that's a very difficult period where we see a big inflection point: depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, etc. Because you go from two things: a set daily structure and understanding of your purpose in the world, to none of those, right? I can get up whenever I want, I can do whatever I want, I can eat ding-dongs in bed till 1 p.m. if I want, and then all of a sudden I used to be really important to a lot of people, and I just disappeared, and that organization is existing without me now, right? And so one of the most helpful actual clinical treatments, if you will, when people start to face this question of self after retirement, is volunteerism. Because it's no longer about the money per se, but it does two things. It provides the structure. I want you to go, and I want you to be there at 8 a.m. 3 days a week, right? And then also, it helps you understand yourself more broadly in relation to the people around you when you lost your broadest avenue for understanding that when you did retire.
Anything more, Gina? I'll put a plug in for the last panel. The only data that the data I've seen, someone can correct me, but I think people who are in faith communities actually proved to actually increase happiness even during the pandemic. It's the only group that did, if I'm right. So I don't know why that, of course I've got my own interest for getting the information out there, but I don't know why that's not publicly very, very commonly known. And I think what it is it forces you into a heterodox community of people of different ages, different worldviews, different politics, towards something bigger than yourself. There's a boring factor to it. There's just all these different things that are about life. That's been my experience, is that getting people into community. But I will say, and that was the point of my question yesterday with Josh, is that it just takes one stink bomb to come into a group and fire off the, what we've been talking about, the postmodern progressive agenda, and people are terrified. And they're just like, okay, I'm out of here. They're accusing me of something, and this is easier at doing this at home. And so I think building community is becoming, building those communities is becoming more challenging with the competition of social media and everything else. And living an individual lifestyle is kind of a very cool thing. It's very comfortable. Everything is tailored to what I want, but it creates a narcissism and a selfishness that community breaks down. So hopefully that will be one of the things. Roberta, you were next with the question.
Thank you. Great information. Great panel. Sad, horrible. More depressed than ever. We'll have to meet. But I do have a question, and that is, I'm old, so I've seen young people for a long, long time in my experience, and it's always fun to hear faculty converse about how, kind of stuff that goes over time. So back in 90s or so, it was all about overly protective parents, and they would come with your 25-year-old to your meeting for your graduate student. We get, health care dependent till you're 26. I mean, we got a lot of these things going on. Did we create a generation that now with children, because it's almost now into the next generation, and that is also influencing, who've not experienced enough risk. And life was pretty good too. I mean, we did have the towers. That was, spooky, scary, but it was pretty contained. And everything else has been pretty peaceful. They didn't have Vietnam. They didn't have a lot of these earth-shattering depression, etc. The recession. So I'm laying the stage because I think, have we created with the last generation the inability to then parent in a way that says, you're going to fall down, you're going to hurt yourself. Life happens, and somebody's not going to fix it for the team. You're going to be the fat kid. You're going to be the whatever. That was life. I mean, social media makes it much worse. I get that. But is there something else underlying that?
So I think you picked up on a number of trends. So one is, and we know this from what they say themselves on surveys, you have teens now much less likely to say that they want to take risks, both financially, physically, everything, and much more risk averse. Because safety has been such an enormous emphasis. And, in most ways, that makes a lot of sense. We've done a really good job keeping kids safer when you look at injury rates and fatalities and everything else, from car accidents to accidents. We've done a good job keeping cigarettes and alcohol and drugs away from kids, much better than in the 90s when Gen Xers and boomers, in the 60s and 70s were, I know, right? Totally. And you can see that, and they admitted to it. Late 70s, you look at marijuana use, it's way up there. So,
you don't want to have these conversations.
Right, I know. So, and that's the funny thing, is that when you look at those statistics, today's kids and teens are safer. But, there's some downsides, right? Because we moved on from just protecting kids from physical dangers to protecting them from experiences. We don't want them to fail or have that conversation where they disagree with someone. There's that huge emphasis on not just physical safety, but what this generation calls emotional safety, which is where you get safe spaces and some of those things coming up. But I also think it is important to put it in the bigger cultural context of that the entire developmental life cycle has slowed down. So in psychology, we talk about this as a slow life strategy versus a fast life strategy. So the slow life strategy that we have now is kids are more protected and they grow to independence much more slowly. So teens, for example, less likely now to have their driver's license, to go out of the house without their parents, to drink alcohol, to date, to have sex, like all of those adult activities, things that adults do and children don't, teens are doing those things later. And then young adults are taking longer to settle into career and get married and have children. And then older adults, 50 is the new 40, 60 is the new 50. Older people, right? I mean, right. So, and this is the case that neither one of these strategies is all bad or all good. There's trade-offs involved in both. But this is what technology has given us: longer lives with less drudgery, better medical care, more education, so that also puts into you having to take longer to grow up. And we just have a slower life. That's a longer life, so there's huge upsides to this. But it does mean 18 is not what it used to be. 18 is now what 15 used to be in terms of just having those experiences out in the world as opposed to online. So there are lots of different things going on.
But then introducing, because I think, okay, in my head, oh yes, you can be on social media when you're 13. Maybe if this slowness, have we now been using the old days when you can do these things actively, but they're not there yet because we've got this longer. Because that's I think what's happening is they're not mature at the age they're coming on.
Right.
Even if it's 13. If in fact I'm seeing them at 25 with their
Right,
mom.
and 13 is clearly too young. That was a compromise. It wasn't chosen for any developmental reason. It'd be much better if it was 16 or even 18. But yeah, even at 13, they just haven't had as much experience out in the world. Then they go on social media on a platform that's designed for adults, and we have some pretty negative outcomes.
And I think you said something really important there, and that's that it's neither all good nor all bad, kind of two different philosophies that have their ups and their downs. But there's this idea in neurobiology called neoteny. Have you guys heard of that, neoteny? Mm-hmm. And it's a state of protracted adolescence. It's the period, each mammalian species has a period of adolescent development that's really important for their adult level of functioning. And human beings actually have the longest state of neoteny compared to nearly any other species, in part because we live longer than almost any other species. But what we do during this period of neoteny is really important, and I think this is what you're getting to. That's when we play, that's when we fail, that's when we hurt ourselves, when we get dirty, when we learn how to communicate, and all of a sudden we're not communicating like we used to or as often as we used to. And it gives us the skills and the tools to be adults. So I think we need to be careful to not say, we need to grow up faster, right? But we need to make sure that this period of adolescence is full and robust to give us the skills to go into adulthood. And what we've done by removing essentially a lot of the essential experiences of adolescence or deferring them to a later age is we have people who are now theoretically on the brink of what used to be considered adulthood saying, I'm not ready to get married. I'm not ready to commit to, I'm far too young to be in my career job. All of these things that social science shows actually confers a lot of health and happiness. People in general who are married and commit to marriages and make them last for the long term are overall much happier. So why are you scared to get married, right? Why is this viewed as a bad thing? So I don't think it's the length of adolescence per se, but it's the experiences within them, which is really what you're getting at. And we need those experiences to build the resiliency, to have the courage to go forward and engage in the institutions that allow us to be healthy and happy.
Anybody who didn't get a question yet? Right here, please.
This has been great, and being of advanced years, I'm going to take some risks.
Go for it.
And it just strikes me that we have a potential solution that's hiding in plain sight, based on all the great talks that we've had. Is that if you go upstream, and we're talking about everything that's revolving around individual, the human condition is really at the source. And when society, right, self-governed and all of that, but how do you change people in the heart? And there's a lot of questions. And many philosophers have, Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil, each individual. And would it be safe to say that really that is the answer, is to find that force to get individuals, right, to do good, because I think that would reverberate into everything else. I mean, humans are great at building better mousetraps to try to mitigate and solve problems, but it seems like that would be the thing. And it's all here. I've heard it all throughout the conversations here. And anyway, I'll just stop at that. And I just think I believe that is really so important. It's something that has been lost to the younger generation, is what they conceive as the American project and the founders and all the issues they were dealing with. I mean, at the end of the day, they're dealing with the human heart in a free society. So where is that force coming from?
Yeah, I'll let you respond, but I know in our discussions, I did sort of conclude in my own thinking, in my own experience, that to the degree that a young person, for example, is loved by somebody, and maybe 2 people, maybe 5 people, but that is my experience of resilience, the degree that you're loved by somebody and somebody really cares about you, and that you learn to love other people. I know this doesn't really, doesn't travel in the material, measurable, but that's just been my experience. What you're talking about is that meaning making and being loved and knowing you're loved and loving somebody else. Those, I think, are the ingredients. And I think when we talked about enchantment, this world is very flat right now that we're living in. It's unenchanted. We flattened out everything that's sort of the good, the true, and the beautiful at some level, if it's not measurable. So I do think that, it's not re-enchanting. I really love that we're not going back to something that's dangerous, but we've got to move forward enchanting this next level. I think you're really onto something. Do you have some thoughts on that?
I do, and I'm going to push back on that a little bit.
Good.
I won't I'm going to disagree.
You're going to push back on love?
I'm going to push back on you, because you said it's unenchanted, and I'm hoping everyone in this room can think of a point in their life where it was filled with love and support and mentorship, maybe a certain period or a certain person. That's the enchantment.
Yeah.
The enchantment isn't going to be a specific policy. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a policy that allows us to engage individually on a human level, that encourages this mentorship and this connection. It's going to be recognizing the programs that are changing people's lives and putting funding towards it, whether they're tutored or not, right? But it's going to be supporting these individual encounters that provide enchantment. And if we're going to do this through a lens of religion, which we ought to do, I mean, what you're getting at, it's love, right? We're called to be God's light in the world. How do we do that? And I think every single person, I hope you've all had the opportunity in your life to be around someone that just radiates joy. And it's really hard to be on your phone when you're around that person, right? And you want to be more like that person. You want to be around that person more. So how do we ourselves become that person, and how do we carry that into the world? That's what we're called to do, right?
Beautiful. Gene, any thoughts?
I can't improve on that.
You can't improve on that.
Very good.
One more question, and then we'll close it out.
Unfortunately, there are increasingly large pockets of disenchantment from younger people that they have no idea or no vision of what it looks like to be enchanted. They do see individuals in their lives that have something. They don't know what it is quite yet, but they have something that is admirable and coveted. So I think that it's really up to all of us, and this is
it all comes back to what we can do personally. I think that's an incredible summary of our time together, really.
Yeah.
What we can do personally to share what, our enchantment or our love. Any other final comments before our panelists?
I think that's a great way to end.
I think that's a great
personally.
way to end, too. All right. Let's end it on that note. Thank you very much to our panelists for guiding us through this.